So my mum would always say this phrase whenever something went wrong growing up. I'd smashed a bowl, or I'd scraped a knee, or a boy had been mean to me, or I hadn't handed in my homework. Oh, She'd say, it's not the end of the world. It's not the end of the world. Not the end of the world. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I feel like this is one of those situations where that phrase doesn't apply. Hello and welcome back to another, oh my god, I think the world's gonna end. Does that happen to you ever? You're in the middle of a sentence and then all of a sudden you realise that everything you've ever read about the climate crisis might render anything you're about to say completely useless, and maybe life is completely meaningless, and why are we even carrying on anyway when it's clearly all going to be underwater in 10 years? Which is why today we're doing a crossover episode, like when your favourite characters turn up in a different show. I have two series on my channel. One is called A Guide to Positive Panic about the climate crisis, and one is called The 20s Toolkit, where I try and equip you with lessons and things to think about in your 20s, things that I wish I'd known in my 20s or things I learned while I was in them. And what I do know is that in my 20s, I was thinking a lot about the climate crisis because, unlike some of the boomers who are making the decisions out there, we're probably going to have to live through the collapse of civilization. Sorry, I got too deep there. Don't turn away. We're not going to be panic-inducing in this video. This video is about climate anxiety. Some thoughts I have on it, imperfectly, yes, but I promise it's going to be an overall positive video. We're going to go to some sad places, but I'm guessing that if you've clicked on those videos, you've already been there. So here are some myths, some lies that I feel like my brain was telling me about the climate crisis during my 20s, and especially and particularly about my emotions about the climate crisis, like what I was really feeling. There is so much more to say about eco-anxiety than is in this video, but I don't know if you've noticed, but we're kind of on a time constraint, and I could have waited another year to try and keep scripting this over and over again. But at this point in humanity's trajectory, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Let us begin. Lie or myth number one. Eco-anxiety is a type of anxiety. Not exactly. I'm going to do that incredibly annoying in this essay I will technique of breaking down those words, but let's just go there for a second. Humour me. Anxiety, okay, what is it? Okay, in the English language it has two definitions. The first definition is a feeling of unease, worry, or fear. Everybody feels it from time to time. It's not pleasant, but it is normal. Our bodies are equipped to deal with it. Nothing to worry about there. The other definition of anxiety is, as defined by the Cambridge English Dictionary, being anxious to act. In a small way, this could be, I'm anxious to hand in a paper, I'm anxious not to be late. But there's a momentum there to the anxiety, I'm anxious to do. And then there's a kind of anxiety that we use as shorthand when what we really mean is an anxiety disorder. They could be things like GAD, SAD, PAD, 3 fairy godmothers you do not want at your christening. Now, these things are psychiatric conditions that are defined by the medical community, and it's worth noting that obviously everybody's experience of anxiety disorders is very different, but broadly they are described as excessive worry, uneasiness, fear of future events, to the extent to which they affect your social and occupational functioning. Now, here's the problem with calling eco-anxiety, worry about the climate crisis, anxiety. One, it hasn't been defined by the medical community. It's like meaning is evolving just as the planetary crisis is. And it's also not necessarily something that needs to be cured in a medical sense or fixed. That's what worries me about using the term anxiety. It's actually a very understandable reaction to a very real threat. It's kind of like asking somebody with a tiger in their house to do CBT. So yes, I guess it is linguistically linked to the medical term anxiety, but it's also linked, I think, when we talk about it, to that Cambridge definition, being anxious to act. Anoska Grose wrote this amazing book called A Guide to Eco-Anxiety, which I read during lockdown and highly recommend. But in it she says, if fear is a reaction to a clear threat, then anxiety is a reaction to an unclear one. We kind of have to hold two truths in our minds when we think about panicking about the planet. The idea of fear, when we hear the facts of what is happening right now and therefore the trajectory it could take us on. That is a very understandable reaction. Fear. And then there's the anxiety we feel when we think about what is, at the end of the day, an unknown outcome. Separate, linked, but separate. The fear and the anxiety, they're slightly different. For that reason, I feel like the term anxiety is both incredibly helpful and incredibly unhelpful because of its intersection with change, which we'll get to in another lie. But Lena, you might call, I am suddenly in danger. This new information has made me realise that I am suddenly in danger. Now that is true for some people. Some people on the planet right now are in immediate danger from things that are happening as a result of climate crisis. But if your Wi-Fi is still working, hello, and you've taken time out of your day to watch this video, I'm going to imagine that the danger is not yet at your door. Or if it is, put down the bowl of Cocoa Pops, turn this off, get your bag. The truth of it is, in this moment, in this day, in this week, in this month, you and your body probably isn't in immediate danger. But when you feel this thing we call eco-anxiety, I have some clues about what might be happening in your body. Now there's this thing called the amygdala. Our ancestors developed it. It was really, really useful for a very long time. It's the kind of the emotional processing in our brain. And it sends signals when it perceives that there might be a threat. Doesn't need to have been processed through the conscious brain yet. Doesn't need to have been fact checked. It talks, it gets on the blower and it's like, oh, hypothalamus, you might want to get going. Pull the lever.
Now sling it up, you pervert, or I'll break your arm.
And the hypothalamus is basically like a thermostat for your body, but it's for memory and stress. So it's like pulling all the levers, making everything happen, sending adrenaline through your body, quickening your breath because it's guessing you're going to need more oxygen because you need to be ready to run away, releasing adrenaline, making your heart pump faster, getting ready to get the fuck out. The fact of the matter is, your body often can't distinguish between a long-term and a short-term threat. It's an echo of some pretty sick, incredible, primitive instinct to self-preserve, but ironically it can get in the way of the very real ways we could self-preserve if we stopped panicking. Long-term survival is the aim, heart palpitations is not the game. Alain De Botton did this really interesting podcast that I returned to a lot during the pandemic, and he talks about this idea that we were ever safe, and go with me here, it's going to be okay, we'll come out again, but the fact that actually we as humans are very rarely actually safe. The only way that we can function in the world is to believe that our bodies are going to be safe and that everything is very predictable. But actually, he says, being alive is always an emergency. And in some ways it makes me think, like, what a privilege to be able to panic. If you're panicking, you are alive. And what a bloody joy. Joy is sometimes the wrong word, but what a fucking steal. That's what I feel. There's this song by The Streets that goes, for millions of years since the outset of time, every single one of your ancestors survived. Every single person on your mum and dad's side successfully looked after and passed on to you live. What are the chances of that? I'll spare you the horrendous Midlands raps, but like, isn't it incredible that if we feel safe, we've forgotten a danger and that we've made it here at all? That's because of those responses in your brain, and I'm never going to be mad about it. But honestly, sometimes I have to sit with myself and think, what did you think the deal with this universe was? What did you think the contract was? Did you think there was never going to be any boulders in your way at all? Like, what was I thinking? But unfortunately, not to sound like your actual nan, but before we start tackling existential crises or huge mindset shifts, we have to prepare our body to be a little bit resilient to stress. And that can be by doing incredibly boring things like drinking water, sleeping, exercising, making sure that our caffeine intake isn't too high. And I know I sound patronising perhaps when I say just breathe, but there's this quote from a poem I love that's like, put down the gun and have a sandwich. And I often feel like being able to respond authentically and truthfully and accurately and sensibly to something, I need to first have a word with Clive in IT, also known as my hypothalamus, and say, guys, some miscommunication, have a Kit Kat, we're going to look at the facts. And the facts aren't great all the time, code red for humanity, etc, etc, but I'm not sending out any warships until I've rolled out the map. The next lie. Humanity has always been heading this way. I knew it. It really depends on the way you've grown up. Like, for me, I feel like it does have maybe a lot to do with how you've been taught to perceive the world and not potentially how the world actually is. But there's this idea of humanity's always making a shit show of it. When you think we've hit a new low, there's a lower bottom. A lower bottom. And really, we've been making a dog's dinner of it since the beginning. Now, I'm not going to say that there haven't been horrible things that are happening right now in the world or in history. But if you can confidently, without bringing any receipts, can look at me in the eyes and say, humanity is always screwing it up, so I'm not surprised that we're screwing this up too. Let's just test that knowledge for us. Let's just play a game with me for a second. Dun, 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 dun. Right now, where we're standing, where does the majority of the world's population live? Is it A, in low-income countries? Is it B, in middle-income countries? Or is it C, in high-income countries?
Middle-income countries!
Not what you were expecting? Okay, don't know how you did on that one. Hope you did well. Maybe you got it wrong. Let's try again. In the last 20 years, so post Feed the World, post those ridiculous bracelets like Make Poverty History, etc, etc, the proportion of the world living in extreme poverty has A, almost doubled, B, remained more or less the same, or C, halved. In the last 20 years, what's happened?
Halved!
Okay, let's try vaccines. Right now, today, in the world, how many of the world's 1-year-olds have been vaccinated against some kind of disease? Not all of them, they don't have a full house, but some kind of disease. Is it 20%, 50%, or 80%? How has the number of deaths from natural disasters changed over the last 100 years? Number of deaths. A, has it more than doubled? B, remained about the same? Or C, decreased by half?
Decreased by half.
Okay, let's go with animals, okay? Some animals are endangered. There's a lot of bad things happening in the world. But let's take an example that I learned at school. In 1996, tigers, giant pandas, and black rhinos were all for it. On the endangered list, absolutely on the way down to zero. But today, now, since 1996, how many of those animals are still critically endangered? 2 of them? 1 of them? None of them?
None of them! None of them.
Now, there is a danger of extrapolating these kind of very wide brushstroke stats that are incredibly true, links below, and using it to silence people who point out some things that could definitely be fixed right now. Some things that maybe over pockets of history, like 100 or maybe even 1,000 years, have gone absolutely bloody terribly. And that kind of toxic use of this kind of data is completely unacceptable. We do not stand. There is no room for that at this inn. However, humanity has been going for 200,000 years. And I personally am surprised, since we don't have any fur, we've got really shit teeth, no tolerance for extreme temperature change, and just in general, a very delicate, fussy inner ecosystem. Our biological structure is an absolute nightmare of a customer. The only reason we've survived this far is because we're the only species that cooperates on a mass level. We try really hard at tasks, whether that's trying to build an arrow or a hut or maybe a super impressive domino system, and we'll return to tasks and innovate. And we'll also swap stuff with other people. We'll swap resources. We'll warn people of dangers. We'll form tribes and networks. Every now and then people have abused that, and we will communicate. And the failure of the sensationalized news cycle is definitely a topic for another day. But safe to say that I feel like humanity needs a bit of a self-worth pep talk. A little bit of a thing. To go around saying that all of humanity is bad and not worth saving just isn't factually correct. The data doesn't support it. And it's taken me reading deeper into things to realise that. Resources below. Let's go on with the next lie, because I could go on about that forever. But the bottom line is, however hard it is to save humanity, however possible it may be, I think a worse thought is thinking it's not worth it, that all of my struggles are for a lost cause because humanity isn't great. I don't really perceive the trajectory of humanity like changing. I think that we will keep getting better and better to each other on the whole, not perfect, but better. It's just a tempo issue we're suffering from. I don't think we're going to get there in the next 100 years unless we really start digging our heels in and getting everybody involved. The climate crisis is the fault of the fossil fuels industry. Whether I panic or I don't panic, it makes no difference. For me, I'd say more that things like the news create the social license for those fossil fuel companies to operate. Platforming deniers misrepresenting the data in proportion as well in fact, like the small amount of climate crisis articles compared to how important this issue right now is even if the articles that they do publish are true, is just. And yes, it's also politicians and business owners and people who have real big scaled power in this world, but also there's the, you know, the article and the stat that's always battered around that it's like 71% of emissions are made by 100 companies. And at first I was like, oh my god, but then I was also like, but those companies are serving us. We create the demand for those 100 companies. They're taking into account what we say with our actions that we want, and they're selling what they make to us. There's this phrase that is attributed to many different people on the internet, and I couldn't find its true source, but the phrase is useful. It says, it's easier sometimes to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And what we're really lacking here is a huge amount of imagination. We're in an imagination deficit right now, because I think that ending capitalism is going to be way more possible than ending life on Earth. And sometimes this phrase is used, and this kind of like, it doesn't matter because it's only these companies and I can't do anything. It's kind of a numbing like practice. I don't know if you've seen the film Seeking a Friend from the End of the World, but in it basically these characters get told that the world is ending. In 30 days a meteor will strike, and the most chilling part of the film for me were the people who were still mowing their lawns, still turning up to their shit jobs, still carrying on with their lives. And often I feel like that with when I learn about the climate crisis, and then I go outside and people are still mowing their lawns, which actually isn't only redundant, but incredibly unhelpful. I understand the instinct to grab on to those kind of like isolated bits of data and then feel like it's a reason to numb. That is an anxious response, but again, it's not a data-based response. And honestly, when it comes to it, does it matter whose fault it is? I don't want to die being right. I want to live by getting on with it and trying to fix other people's mistakes without constantly just resisting acting because it wasn't me who broke the vase, mum. Another myth. No one will understand how I'm feeling. This is one I'm still unlearning. I find it hard to talk to people in my immediate life, to be honest, about the climate crisis when I am worrying about it. And if you're watching this and you know me in real life, please come and talk to me about the climate crisis. I kind of want to talk about it all the time. Even when I don't want to talk about it, I need to talk about it. So please come talk to me about it. Okay, thanks, bye. But again, let's go back to the data. Anxiety UK say that 1 in 10 adults in the UK will experience some kind of debilitating anxiety disorder within their lifetime. So that's 1 in 10. That's the anxiety side of it. The Evening Standard says that last year 85% of British adults were extremely worried about global warming, which is the highest figure since studies began. Now, I don't have big eco-anxiety data for lots of different reasons. That hasn't been provided, the term hasn't been defined. I get why there isn't that much data on it. But if we cross over these two arbitrary bits of data, we can see that at least in the UK, 1 in 10 adults will understand what you mean by the kind of anxiety that you're feeling. They will be able to understand in some capacity. And 85% of adults in the UK are concerned about global warming. You feel like there's a Venn diagram. I feel like there are some people in your life, either physically or in your digital realms, that will get exactly what you're talking about if you open up about your eco-doom. Maybe we should just call it eco-doom. Thoughts below. I don't know if that's more helpful. But knowing that kind of data is really useful when your brain is like, nobody will understand you, just shut down, don't say anything, act normal. I would highly encourage you to start measured, calm conversations with people in your life about how you're feeling. And if that doesn't work, finding the people who are literally sending up light signals being like, hey, I'm over here, I'm worried about it, I'm worried about it too. Get involved in your Greenpeace group, your local climate action movement. You will meet some characters probably, but in my experience that is never a bad thing. There are people out there who are explicitly shouting, I am panicking. Go forth and find them. I need to have eco-anxiety. I'm not getting rid of it. Without it, I won't act. I genuinely felt for a long time that I needed to stay as guilty as possible and live in a constant state of stress in order to motivate myself to take action. Again, data deficit. That's not how stress works. Brené Brown is a shame researcher and has done loads of different papers on why shame and guilt are debilitating and not in any ways that humans are motivated to change or take action. But the reality is that for anybody alive today, the events that led us to this point definitely started before you were born. They most likely weren't your decision and were made within a society that you did not design. The term eco-guilt, I think, is only useful to a certain point, and I think it's also important to state that just because you're not guilty of something doesn't mean you're not responsible for it. Often I will guilt myself into not acting sooner, even though I hadn't given myself the space or the time or the resources to process the information and work out how best to act on it. Reframing guilt as responsibility or even opportunity can give you some momentum, and I have a video up here about responsibility and stuff like that. But I also think comparing our feelings about the planet to grief is also a tricky one, because it implies that it's already over, that there isn't a fight to fight, there's nothing to save, which again, as we've discussed with the data, just isn't true. Sure, we can't return to the ecosystem we had before, and a horrendous amount of land, animals and human lives have been lost, and that is incredibly devastating. However, to just apply generalized guilt to the climate crisis isn't logical or accurate. There's so much still left to play for, and I think sometimes when we use like grief or guilt, we want them to sound dramatic because we're trying to draw attention to the fact that we're feeling something and want people to listen. But I think it's better to give ourselves the license to just call it sadness and responsibility or being anxious to act. It is okay to be sad. It is okay to feel nervous about your part in it and the best next course of action. That's normal. It's really important to recognize where you're at, validate how you're feeling, and not force yourself to be superficially cheerful about something that is gonna be an incredibly long slog. I won't give you a whole serenity prayer like, give me the wisdom to change the things I cannot accept and the courage to know the difference, but you get my meaning, right? Forcing yourself into a feeling of guilt or grief to act is just gonna make you hit a wall. But accepting that nervousness, that sadness, is a step towards activism. It's a step towards getting to the point where you can start moving. And I think you'll be surprised when you see how much there is to change. My individual actions won't make a difference. I'm gonna sing at you again, I'm sorry. This one's from Harry and Chris. They say it's just a drop in the ocean, as if that's a reason to stop. Maybe they've forgotten the ocean is literally made out of drops. Again, not completely factually true. Admittedly, there are different impacts of you lobbying an MP to do something really big around policy versus remembering to bring your keep cup. But I've talked before up here about how eco tools can be a way into things. The small things you do and the small bothers that you go through in your life can motivate you to act in different ways. And a lot of ways you can act are actually just free. Stopping buying things is free. Contacting your MP is free. It is incredibly heartening for me, even if I sometimes don't have time to join them, to look at all of the charities and campaigning groups around eco-anxiety and realise that they're all volunteers, they're all doing it for free. And I've realised as well that those small actions that I take impact me massively when it comes to self-perception. And I feel like not changing at least the parts of my lifestyle that I can when it comes to the planet is kind of gaslighting myself. I'm kind of saying, you didn't see that documentary, you didn't read that book, you don't really live in this reality, you live in this other reality. Like, I was trying to make myself feel loopy and like it wasn't happening, and that is not good for your brain. I think sometimes those small actions can affirm a wider truth that you know, and that can just make you feel like you're living in reality more, you know? I think with the lawn mowing thing, even if you're having a good time mowing the lawn or carrying on with your life like this isn't happening, the despair can come in knowing that that is a surreal way to live. And that was actually more distressing for me to not believe it as true and act like it is true. Don't gaslight yourself, basically. And may I say, you're looking like an incredibly dashing drop. There are no solutions! Let's just take a moment of silence for all of the experts that have been working on the solutions for like decades, shall we? You can almost hear them internally combusting. In service of my crusade to try and make this video under an hour long, I'm not going to list them all here, but I have composed a little alphabetic song. Roll music.
Alternative cement, biomass power, carbon taxing, dynamic glass, electric trains, farm irrigation efficiency, Green New Deal, hydrofluorocarbon, indigenous land right, justice for bees, KLK, LEDs, multi-strata agroforestry, nutrient management, onshore wind, plant-based ice cream, quantitative easing, regenerative agriculture, solar panel, trees, universal basic income, very good therapists, wetland protection, xenophobes re-educated into xenial hosts for climate refugees, yeast bioreactors, zany solutions that the 7.9 billion of us on this planet will probably come up with in the next 10 years. Give us a chance, jeez.
If you haven't heard of most of those things, that's not surprising. My grandmother probably hadn't heard of most of the things that make my modern life run every day. I'm not surprised that you haven't heard about them, but why not just play a game today, pick the one that starts with the first letter of your name and look at the links that I've left in the description. Just because you haven't heard of it doesn't mean it's not there, but it does mean that you should probably start looking at a wider variety of news outlets when you get in your news. But none of those solutions are gonna get done in time, Leena. Well, like I said, it's not over.
Still isn't over.
Most of the scientists don't think it's over yet. But plotting a plummeting graph further downwards is incredibly mathematically easy to do. Plotting a graph turning upwards and at what rate it will turn upwards is harder to do. We just don't have the data to say how fast we can turn this around and at what pace. And that's because it involves loads of things like social pacing, like how fast can we change things, and therefore how fast will that affect the science. This is uncharted territory. We do not know. If anybody can collect the data for humanity's capacity for revolution, I would be fascinated to hear your methodology. But just like Brené Brown was doing shame research and she realised she wasn't measuring love, and then all of her colleagues were like, well, we can't measure love, and she's like, yes, but it is a huge factor in most of my patients' relationships, so I probably should factor it in even if I can't measure it. But what I do lean on is thinking that actually this is the optimum time for me to be born in. I am ecstatic personally in my situation to have been born in the last 30 years. Any earlier, and I wouldn't have got abortion rights. If I got married, it would have been legal for my husband to sexually assault me, and I probably wouldn't have been able to get a credit card, let alone any other human rights if I was born even earlier. And if I was born any later, it would be too late to act. Like, if I was born in 2050 or 2090, yeah, things would look a little bit more screwy. But from where I'm sitting today, this is actually the optimum time that I could have been born. And I have no fantasies of being born in any other age. Thank you. I am born in the age where I have all the information and I have the time to act. What a hand of aces. Oh my God. And the last one. But Leena, if we think things are going to end and they're going to get worse, there is no point in living. Now that is a darker question that I don't feel equipped to cover in this video. But what I will say, like with that, for millions of years since the outset of time, every single one of our ancestors survived. Let's just humour you and say, yeah, actually this is the end. We're definitely a goner. There's no point in trying. Hail in the uninhabitable earth. I'd then say to you, so all of these cool people lived before you. They created these incredible catalogue of art and science and literature and sick dance moves, and you're not going to even enjoy the last stage of humanity. You're not even going to respect their memory by learning more about them, by singing the songs that they wrote, by enjoying being the last humans. You're not even gonna like revel in it before it's gone. I just think of like some of my ancestors who I think were all on like an Irish farm somewhere, calling me up and being like, hey, I hear that you made it to the cut. You're in like the last age of humanity. Like, what's going on? What are you doing? Oh, so actually I've just stayed inside feeling despair and thinking that life is pointless. Well, are you singing anything cool? No. Are you at least following some of your dreams? I'm just here shoveling cow muck into a bucket and wondering if I'm going to get syphilis before the age of 15. No. Actually, I did go on a good walk the other day, but no, in general I'm just staring into the void. What the fuck? If I was my ancestors, I'd be pissed off. If you can't say that humanity is worth saving, you can at least pinpoint some people in history and say they're worth celebrating. And I think we can only honour the memory of the people who have been trying, grafting, dying, sweating to pass on life itself. We can only honour those people by, if not trying to preserve parts of humanity, at least letting ourselves have a bit of a laugh and a good time in what they built. Well, that was a ride, wasn't it? Pep talks make me sweaty. Thank you so much for watching this video. I rarely take sponsorships on this channel. Everything that you see and get for free is because people pay for it in the Gumption Club. They tip me per video so that these videos can keep happening, and in return I add them to a secret Facebook group where we often talk about climate collapse, among loads of other things. And I do a weekly podcast just for them. If you're interested in becoming a member, I'll leave the links below. If you like this video, you might like the 20s Toolkit series. You might also like the Positive Panic series. And if you didn't hate being here and you'd like to be here again, hit the subscribe button. That is all for today. Frog Snog out.
You should be on the parade if you're doing busking.
Oh no, I'm not that good yet, don't worry.